And I just want to talk about the idea of implicit bias, because it's sort of a word that maybe some of you don't think means much. And what it means is the bias that we bring to any interaction we have with any other human being. In this case specifically, it's the bias that we bring to someone whose skin color is darker, black, brown, any number of gradients on that scale. And I want to start with the idea because I think a lot of the problems in this country boil down to the idea that being biased against someone for their race makes you a bad person. It does not make you a bad person. Every single person in this country has implicit bias based on race. We need to start from there, from understanding that I have implicit bias based on race. Tina has implicit bias based on race. My sister has implicit bias based on race. Terry has implicit bias based on race. Jordan has implicit bias based on race. Isaac has implicit bias based on race. Everyone has implicit bias based on race. It does not make you a bad person. It's just a fact. If we can start from there, then we can make some progress. Because if you can just accept that you're not a bad person because you have implicit bias based on race, then you're able to take the next step to start examining what are your implicit biases. What are you afraid of when you see a black person or a brown person? Why, when I walk into certain businesses in Los Alamos where I've lived for nearly 50 years, why do I still, even when I'm wearing a suit, why do I get followed around like I'm going to steal something? I mean, seriously. Why? Why, when I go to a restaurant in Santa Fe to get a table for 5 people and I'm standing there patiently waiting in line to say that I've got a party of 5, why does the hostess, who's a person of color, look at me and then turn her attention to the white lady standing behind me and say, how many? And put me in a position where I feel like I have to be rude and say, oh, 5. It's just implicit bias. It's not that they're bad people. Where I judge someone is when they refuse to acknowledge their implicit bias, when they refuse to engage with that self-reflection. That's where we should be judging people. And I just wanted to put that context out there because it's really important. And what are some of the things that we could be doing as a community, as a country, to deal with implicit bias? Unfortunately, I haven't had time to do the research into finding out if there are effective evidence-based programs related to implicit bias training. But here's what we can do. We can demand that at least for organizations that we have like a lot of control over, like the county or different public organizations, we can demand that everyone in HR gets a lot of implicit bias training. Because if we look back through history, if we want to look at how racism acts in the U.S. today, mostly we don't have too many interactions with overt bigotry. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It does happen. Mostly that's not the case, though. Mostly what happens is that Elizabeth or Ron are more likely to get a job interview than Jamal or Lakeisha. A guy named Jose spent 6 months looking for a job interview as a computer programmer, and as soon as he changed his resume so that it said Joe instead of Jose, he had 5 calls the next day. True story. That's implicit bias. And I guarantee you that the HR manager or whoever was involved in filtering out the Jose resume versus the Joe resume would be horrified to see that, because they don't want to be overt bigots. Nobody wants to be an overt bigot. And it causes us to refuse to examine ourselves and to see where we are being bigoted, because we've judged ourselves, and the only response we have is to say, oh, no, that's not me. Well, maybe it is. Maybe it is. So what I want to see is I want to see HR departments have required annual implicit bias training about gender, about race, about language. I want to see police departments have required annual implicit bias training about those same things. I want to see managers have required annual implicit bias training. I want to see public officials, before they can get sworn in, have required implicit bias training. I want to see our senators, our congressmen, president, everyone. Anyone who has influence over the lives of a lot of people should be required to have implicit bias training in order for us to be a better country. That's what I want to see. And I want to thank everyone. I think that this has been a good event. And that's it.